The relief was 6 days late. That's how it starts. Not with a scream, not with blood, just a man on the deck of a steamer, cold to the bone, watching a rock rise out of the sea, seeing that something's wrong. His name is Joseph Moore. It's the day after Christmas, 1900. He's a lighthouse keeper coming back from shore leave. As the boat pitches toward the island, he's looking for the usual things. The flag on the mast, the supply boxes stacked at the landing. One of the lads at the rail lifting a hand. None of it's there. The flagpole's bare. The boxes haven't been moved. And the gallery around the great lamp, where someone should be standing, is empty. He tells himself the wind has kept them busy. He tells himself that the whole way up, and it's a long way up. 200 stone steps cut into the side of the rock. The only sound is the sea and his own breathing. The gate's shut. He opens it. The door's shut. He opens that too. He calls out. Nobody answers. Inside, the clock has stopped. The fire's dead. Not banked, not glowing. Just cold grey ash. 2 of the 3 beds are made, and on the table, the small ordinary business of the 3 men's lives sits right where they left it. But the 3 men are gone. Not hurt, not hiding, not anywhere on an island you can cross in a few minutes. Gone. Off a locked rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. And in the 120 years since, no one has ever proven what took them. Tonight, we're going to work out what did. But here's the strange part. It isn't the mystery. It's that almost everything you think you know about this story, the meal left on the table, the chair knocked over, the terrifying words in the logbook, none of it was real. Someone made it up. And before we can find the truth, we have to clear all of that away. Let's start with the rock. The rock explains almost everything. The Flannan Isles sits off the northwest coast of Scotland, out past the Isle of Lewis, where the map more or less gives up. There are a handful of tiny, empty inlets. The biggest one is called Eileen Moor, Gaelic for the Big Island, which tells you how much anyone ever bothered to say about the place. It isn't big. It's a slab of rock, maybe 500 yards long. Cliffs ring every side and drop straight down into the sea. On top there's a crown of grass, good for nothing but a few sheep, and even the sheep had to be lowered onto it by rope. For centuries, nobody lived there at all. Shepherds from Lewis would row out, graze their animals, and leave before dark. And they had rules about the place. You took your hat off when you landed. You didn't say certain words. Little careful habits. The kind people build up around somewhere the sea can cut off in an afternoon. There was a ruined chapel on the summit, from some hermit dead 1,000 years. They called the whole group the 7 Hunters. It was not a place you were meant to stay. Then, in 1899, they built a lighthouse on it. They had to. The waters west of Lewis were a graveyard. A light on that rock would carry for miles and save ships. So 150 men spent 4 years hauling stones up those cliffs to raise it. When they lit it, it was one of the most powerful lights in Scotland. It was also one of the loneliest postings in all of Britain. 3 men at a time, weeks on end. 20 miles from the nearest other living soul, with the whole grey Atlantic to themselves. Hold on to that loneliness. It's the thing that makes what happened both possible and, later, impossible to solve. There were no other witnesses out there. There were never going to be. The 3 men on the rock that December were good at this. James Ducat was the principal keeper, nearly 20 years in the service. Thomas Marshall was his second assistant, and the third man was a local, Donald MacArthur, standing in on the rotation to fill a gap. Between them, they'd done this job in weather that would scare most people right off the coast, and they'd done it without a scratch. On the 12th of December, everything was normal. We know that, because we can still read what they wrote down. After the 15th, there's nothing. Here's the sequence, as close as the records let us get. The lighthouse was due for a relief around the 12th of December. The steamer Hesperus would come out, swap one keeper for another, drop supplies, take the mail, but December on that coast is a fight between the boat and the weather was winning. The Hesperus couldn't sail. Then, On the night of the 15th, another ship passed by, a steamer called the Archter. Running in the dark, her crew looked for the Flannan light. It's one of the brightest in Scotland. On a clear night, you can't miss it. They didn't see it. They made a note of it, the way you note something odd, and carried on. And through nobody's real fault, that note didn't reach the lighthouse board with any urgency. So the dark light stayed dark for another 11 days, while a storm sat on the coast and the Hesperus waited for a gap. The gap finally came the day after Christmas, Boxing Day. The Hesperus punched out to the rock, carrying supplies and the relief keeper, Joseph Moore. And that's where the cold open left off. No flag, no boxes, nobody at the rail, Moore climbing the steps into a silence that only got louder the higher he went. Now, I want to slow down here, because this is the exact point where the true story and the famous story split apart, and I'd rather you had the true one. Here's what Moore actually found. The men who were there wrote it down afterward, so we can be fairly sure of it. The gate and the doors were closed. Inside, 2 beds were made and 1 was not. The kitchen clock had wound down and stopped, which it does on its own in a day or two if nobody winds it. The fire was long dead, and the oilskins were the tell. Oilskins are the heavy waterproofs. In that weather, you could never go outside without them. Moore found 1 set still hanging on its hook, just 1. The other 2 men's foul weather gear was gone. Sit with what that's telling you. 2 men had dressed for the sea and gone out into it, and a third had followed them, in whatever he had on indoors, without his coat. Nobody was on the island. Moore and the crew searched every foot of it they could reach. 3 men were simply not there. That's what was found. Hold it in your head. The cold fire, the 2 missing sets of boots, the 1 coat left behind. Because now I have to tell you about everything that wasn't found. The things someone added later. The things that turned a tragedy into a ghost story. If you've heard of the Flannan Isles before tonight, here's what you've probably heard. You heard there was a meal on the table, untouched, the food still warm, as if the men had stood up mid-bite and walked into the sea. You heard a chair was knocked over on the floor as if someone had leapt up in terror. And most of all, you heard about the logbook. That in the days before they vanished, the entries got stranger and stranger. That a storm of impossible fury battered the tower, though no storm was recorded anywhere near them. That the toughest of the 3 men broke down and wept. That 1 went silent. That another was heard praying. Grown men, career keepers, praying and crying in a lighthouse that stands, to this day, on solid rock. And that the last entry simply read, "God is over all." It's a genuinely chilling story. It's also almost completely made up. There was no half-eaten meal. There was no overturned chair. That image comes from a poem. In 1912, 12 years after the men had vanished, an English poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a piece called Flannan Isle. It's very good, and it's fiction. Gibson gave us the untouched plates and the fallen chair because they made the horror land. And those log entries? The storm, the weeping, the praying, God is over all? They don't appear in the official investigation at all. They turn up later, in magazine retellings, the kind that got paid by the thrill, decades after the fact. The real log was the log of 3 professionals doing their jobs. The last real entry was ordinary, and the storm they supposedly wrote about, raging around them on days the mainland was calm, it didn't rage because it wasn't there. I'm spending time on this for a reason. The invented version tells you the men saw it coming, that they had time to be afraid, time to write it down, time to pray. It turns the sea into a monster with a plan. And every spookier theory you've heard, the sea serpents, the ghost ships, the 1 keeper who supposedly murdered the other 2, every one of them is built on a foundation a poet laid. Take that foundation away, and here's what's left. A cold hearth, 2 missing coats, 1 coat still on the hook, and a question that the man who investigated it took very seriously and answered better than the ghost story ever could. Because the island did keep a record, not in ink, in damage. The investigator was Robert Muirhead, a superintendent for the lighthouse board. As it happened, he'd hired all 3 of these men himself. He knew them, and he went over that rock like a detective. What he found, he wrote down plainly. It's the best evidence we have. There are 2 landings on Eileen Moor, one east, one west. That way a boat can always come in on the sheltered side, whatever the wind's doing. The east landing was fine, the west landing was not. The west landing sits high up on the cliff. The working platform and its crane are set well above the water, because the sea on that side can climb. And when Muirhead reached it, he found wreckage. A wooden box was bolted into a crevice in the rock, 110 feet above the normal sea line. It had been torn out and smashed. Its contents, ropes, crane handles, were scattered and tangled. Iron railings were bent flat. A rope had been ripped off its fastenings and left hanging down toward the water. Turf had been torn off the cliff edge. Even a big block of stone had been shoved out of place. 110 feet up. Say that number again. Something had reached 110 feet above the sea and torn iron out of solid rock. Anyone knows that coast knows what does that. Not a monster, not a ghost. A wave. In a big Atlantic storm on a cliff shaped just wrong. The sea doesn't only rise, it funnels. It rears up, it comes up the rock in a wall of water and weight. And no one caught in it survives. Keepers and fishermen had described these freak surges for generations. The west landing of Eileen Moor was practically built to make them. So put the pieces on the table. 2 men, dressed for the worst weather, had gone down to the west landing, almost certainly to tie down that crane and box before the storm tore them apart. That's the job. That's exactly what they'd have done. And the 3rd man, the one who left his coat behind, was up in the tower, safe, dry, and then something made him run out into the storm without stopping to grab it. Here's the picture Muirhead landed on. Most people who've studied it since agree, and I'll be straight with you about which parts are solid and which parts are as filling a gap. The solid part, a great sea struck the west landing while men were working there, and it took them. The damage proves the water came up that high with that force. The missing gear proves 2 men were down there, dressed for it. That much isn't really in doubt. The gap is the 3rd man and his missing coat. That part we can only picture. And the most human version, the one Muirhead leaned toward, goes like this. Ducat and Marshall go down to the west landing to lash everything down before the storm peaks. MacArthur stays up top, and from the tower, or the doorway, he sees it coming, a wave building out of the grey, bigger than it has any right to be, rolling straight at the 2 men who have their backs to the water and their hands full of rope. And he does the thing you'd hope you'd do, and pray you never have to. He runs, no coat, no time, down toward the landing to shout, to warn them, to drag them back, and the sea takes all 3 at once. The 2 who never saw it, and the one that tried to save them. I want to be clear, we can't prove that last part, nobody saw it. It's a reading of evidence, not a fact, and an honest telling has to say so. Maybe MacArthur was already down there, maybe it happened in some other order. What the rock proves, for certain, is only this. The sea came up over 100 feet, and where the 3 men had been, there were none. But I'll tell you why Muirhead's version has lasted over a century. It's not because it's dramatic, it's because it's ordinary. 3 good men doing a dangerous job the way they'd done it 100 times. On the one day the sea decided to be bigger than they were. There's no villain in it. There's no warning scrawled in a log. There's just work and weather, and the thin margin those men lived inside every single day, closing all at once. The ghost story asks you to believe something reached out in the dark and chose them. The truth is worse, in a quieter way. Nothing chose them. The sea didn't choose. It was just there, the way it had always been there, a few feet higher than usual on the wrong afternoon. They relit the lamp, of course. The new crew went out within days. The light couldn't stay dark. Other men were out there in the same water, trusting it. The Flannan Isles light still turns today, though there's no one on the rock to tend it now. They automated it decades ago. It runs alone, sweeping the same stretch of sea that took James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. And it has never explained itself, because it can't. Lights don't remember, so we remember instead. And for 100 years, we've remembered it wrong. The meal, the chair, the terrified log, because the invented version lets us pretend the men understood what was happening to them, that they got a moment. The real version doesn't even give us that. It gives us a cold fire, a coat on a hook, and a wave that nobody lived to describe. That's the thing about this fire, and the stories we tell around it. The monster is almost never the scary part. The scary part is how thin the line is. 110 feet, a few seconds, one coat left on a hook. That's the whole distance between an ordinary day at work and being a name in a mystery some stranger tells in the dark a century later. There's another vanishing I keep coming back to. Not 3 men, a whole colony, hundreds of them, on off an American island, and leaving one word carved into a post. No storm to blame there, no sea to point at, just an empty settlement and a riddle we still haven't cracked. But that is a story for another night. Keep the fire going. I'll see you next time.